It was the 21st of July 1942. Advancing eastwards across the sweltering steppe below the Don River was Paulus's 6th Army. Most of the men marched on foot, but in decent weather like this, some of their motorised divisions could drive 200 kilometres in a single day. Their aim was to cross the Don Bend, strike into the city of Stalingrad, then move southeast to take Astrakhan. This would secure the northern flank of the other Axis armies who were about to charge south into the Caucasus, the main objective of the German summer offensive. Some of Paulus's divisions were currently tasked with guarding the army's northern flank along the Don. This meant that the force directed against the Soviet Stalingrad front wasn't his entire army. However, the advancing portion was still a large force, consisting of 5 foot infantry divisions, 1 panzer or armoured division, and 2 motorised infantry divisions, totalling a huge 120,000 men and 170 tanks, plus more assault guns and tank destroyers as well. Contrasting this to the Soviet side, we see a major difference in the quality of the opposing armies. With the disintegration of Soviet forces during the initial stages of Fall Blau, the German 1942 summer offensive, several Soviet reserve armies had been activated to defend the Stalingrad area as part of Marshal Timoshenko's Stalingrad front. 2 of these were the 62nd and 64th Armies, now arriving on the western side of the Great Don River, with orders to stand fast to the last man and not allow Axis forces to cross the Don. Kolpaktchi's 62nd Army quickly began forming a bowed line from Kletskaya on the Don to Zurovikina on the Shur River, while Gordov's 64th Army was hastily deploying south of the Shur. Various Soviet units would continue to arrive over the next few days, hardly having enough time to do any digging in, and those that did arrive lacked about a third of their light and heavy machine guns, as well as other equipment. Soviet rifle divisions were meant to have had nearly 11,000 men within them, but 19 of Stalingrad Front's 38 divisions had fewer than 2,500 men, 14 of which had less than 1,000, and none of the others had over 8,000. Even if they had been at full strength, Soviet units would still be smaller than their equivalent Axis counterparts, which started the campaign with between 14 and 16,000 men, depending on division. So, to give a more accurate representation of the various unit strengths, Soviet units will be downgraded in size. So, for example, a Soviet division will be the size of a German brigade, reflecting the number of men within the unit. This isn't a perfect solution, but as a general measure, it's a better way of representing the size differences. It's also worth noting that these divisions were accompanied by other units, including 2 naval rifle brigades and 8 officer cadet schools. As Alexei Isayev has pointed out, the use of military schools testifies to the intensity of the struggle and the critical situation in the southern sector of the front. Only in a truly catastrophic situation does the command refuse to complete the training of cadets as officers and throws them into battle as ordinary infantry. 64th and 62nd Armies had a combined total of 102,926 men at this time, supported by 332 tanks. This was versus Paulus's attacking force of 120,000 men and 170 panzers, not including German assault guns or tank destroyers. Perhaps half of these Soviet tanks were light tanks, mostly T-70s, while the majority of the German tanks were the medium Panzer IIIs and IVs, which were much more suited to tank versus tank combat. In addition, the Germans had ample anti-tank guns and significant infantry anti-tank capabilities and air support. Plus, at this point, the Germans were experts at combined arms warfare, and will separate the enemy's tanks from their infantry and anti-tank guns, isolate them, and destroy them piecemeal. So it's worth keeping this in mind that the tank versus tank numbers alone don't tell the full story. But the Axis did have major supply problems. They were roughly 2,000 kilometers from Berlin, and their logistical services were completely overwhelmed, and had been for quite some time. This was made worse locally by the transfer of forces to Paulus's army during the Fall-Blau campaign, without the necessary logistical organisation to compensate, meaning Paulus had more forces than he should have had, and wasn't getting any additional supplies for them. Worse, supplies that should have gone to Paulus had actually been redirected south, leaving 6th Army even more short of badly needed supplies. So bad were the supply services that on the 21st of July, General Major Helmuth Schlomer, 3rd Motorized Division's commander, had to leave the entire 8th Infantry Regiment and other divisional elements behind so that the rest of the division could be supplied with fuel in order to keep the advance going. The other divisions were suffering similar issues, and they hadn't even got into the fighting yet, let alone moved into the city of Stalingrad. It's worth keeping this in mind as we continue this series. The Germans were continually suffering from logistical problems throughout this campaign, which impacted their conduct of it. But despite these problems, they had orders to advance, and that's what they would do. Paulus's plan of attack against the Soviet forces ahead of him was to use 2 wedges of tanks to break through the Red Army defences, get to the Don River as quickly as possible, then surround and destroy the Soviets in pockets west of the river. It was a bold plan for the introverted commander of the 6th Army, General de Panzertrooper Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus. At 52 years of age, a capable staff officer and a good organiser, Paulus was a quiet but moody man who never lost his temper and didn't like it when others showed their emotions. He was reserved, tidy, and always fretted over his personal appearance. His love for Beethoven was only surpassed by his love for Adolf Hitler, whom he considered a genius and an excellent leader for Germany. And it was this man, the man with slender hands, who was going to lead his army into the hell of Stalingrad. But was he even capable of getting his men to the city in the first place? 22nd of July 1942, a sweltering 53 degrees Celsius. The mobile force of Paulus's 6th Army was 14th Panzer Corps, commanded by General der Infanterie Gustav Anton von Wietersheim. This consisted of 3rd Motorized, 60th Motorized and 16th Panzer Divisions. Moving from Bokovskaya, 3rd and 60th Motorized Divisions reached Kletskaya by nightfall, flanked by the 100th Jaeger and 113th Infantry Divisions of Heitz's 8th Army Corps. A Jaeger or Hunter division is meant to be a light but fast-moving infantry division with fewer infantry regiments and lighter artillery than a regular infantry division. The idea being that you can move quicker with less infantry and with lighter artillery. But Zanner's 100th Jaeger division actually had a new 3rd Regiment attached to it. This was Pavicich's 369th Reinforced Croatian Infantry Regiment, also known as the Croatian Legion. So, while 100th Jaeger Division did have lighter artillery, it wasn't a weak division by any stretch of the imagination. General Major Hans Valentin Huber and his 16th Panzer Division were further south. They were supported on the right by the 297th and 71st Infantry Divisions of 51st Army Corps. These crossed the Cher River and continued east towards the Soviet defensive lines. In preparation for the fighting ahead, 16th Panzer Division split into 4 combat groups. One of them was Kampfgruppe Lattmann, which was partly comprised of von Strachwitz's 1st Panzer Battalion from 2nd Panzer Regiment and 3 other battalions. This was the same unforgettable Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz von Großzeuger und Kamenetz, who would later command the Großdeutschland Regiment, take part in the Battle of Kursk, and take part in Operation Doppelkopf, the semi-successful rescue operation to free Army Group North from its pocket in the northern Baltics prior to the Kurland Pocket. At the same time as 16th Panzer Division was forming Kampfgruppen, so too was Kollemann's 60th Motorized Danzig Division. Due to fuel shortages and the need to get to the Don in good time, it was decided to create a divisional combat group. This group, which I'm going to refer to as Kampfgruppe 60, consisted of Huhn's 160th Panzer Battalion, the 160th Motorcycle Battalion, and 1 battalion of infantry. At this stage of the war, the German motorized divisions were equipped with 1 Panzer Battalion each, providing an armoured spearhead and, in theory, making the motorized divisions almost as powerful as a regular panzer division. There were discussions going on at the time about whether diluting the panzer strength amongst the motorized divisions like this was right or wrong, but the main thing to note is that both 3rd and 60th motorized divisions were equipped with panzers at this time. Currently, Huhn's 160th Panzer Battalion had 54 panzers, and 3rd Motorised Division's 103rd Panzer Battalion had 43 panzers. Huber's 16th Panzer Division had about 70 panzers, bringing Paulus's and Weitersheim's total number of tanks to about 170. Above them flew the fighter aircraft and Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers of General Oberst Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4. Richthofen was the cousin of Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron from the First World War, and had actually served in the same squadron with him. He had extensive experience in the Luftwaffe, having commanded units in Spain, Poland, and France. On this day, Italian fighters from 21st Gruppo escorted Richthofen's Stukas, freeing up the German Bf-109s to deal with the Soviet IL-2s, Yaks, and Lend-Lease Hurricanes of Kryukin's 8th Air Army. Back on the ground, the consequences of Timoshenko's failures during Fall Blau, as well as other times during the war so far, led Stalin to replace him on this day. Vasily Gordov was made the Stalingrad Front's commander, leaving the 64th Army in the hands of Vasily Ivanovich Chukov. Chukov was an energetic but ruthless commander who had, under Stalin's orders, willingly executed his own officers during his command of the 9th Army in the Winter War. He had also seen action in Poland, but had not, until now, led forces against the Germans. The Stavka thought he was an untested and unknown general, which he was, but Chukov was about to become the central character in this battle, perhaps the most important Soviet commander during the Stalingrad campaign. However, the replacement of commanders at this critical moment caused confusion for the Soviet troops under the 64th Army, and Chukov barely had time to react to the events which were rapidly unfolding. I'd like to give a special thanks to historian Anton Jolly, who helped with the research for this series. Check out his YouTube channel, Stalingrad Battle Data, link in the description. One of Hitler's goals during his rise to power was to make Germany self-sufficient in resources, because he rejected the idea of trading with international Jewish finance, as he referred to it. He believed that if Germany kept trading her industrial goods in exchange for food from unindustrialized nations, they would be able to industrialize, cease trading their food, and cause Germany to starve in turn. Hitler feared that this starvation would be exploited by the Jews, who would usher in a Marxist revolution and end the Aryan race and all of civilization. So, to stop this, Hitler aimed to make Germany self-sufficient in resources, and in order to become autarkic, Hitler would conquer the lands of the East, enslave their peoples, and extract the food and oil that the industrial German heartland needed to prosper. But until this happened, the Third Reich would suffer. The food crisis was severe. Germans had seen their food rations decreased in the May of 1941. Belgian miners had gone on strike during the winter of 1940 in protest over their inadequate food supplies, and Belgian prisoners inside jails were on 1,550 calories a day, which was why they started to die of starvation in 1942. Reacting to the shortage, the Germans confiscated food from continental Europe, starving the Greeks, the Ukrainians, and 1.5 million Soviet prisoners of war in 1941. Hitler was adamant that everyone else would starve first before a single German went hungry. Of course, the food crisis was made worse by the oil crisis. In 1941, with the British blockade on the go, Germany was in an oil deficit of epic proportions. The European Axis consumed 9,558,000 tonnes more oil than it produced. This was so bad that if there had been a second Romania supplying Germany oil in 1941, that still wouldn't have been enough to meet her demands. Worse, fuel shortages led to the decline of harvest yields, because tractors need fuel to operate, further deepening the food crisis. Even transporting the food they had to where it was needed became problematic. Thousands of litres of milk went to waste in the French countryside every day, because no petrol was available to ensure regular collections. By December 1940, the Kriegsmarine was operating at 50% of its oil requirements, and the German army gave serious consideration to a partial demotorization of its units. This is despite the fact that the army was mostly horse-powered anyway, with only a handful of motorized and armoured panzer units in operation. Their logistics were already so miserable as a result of the oil crisis and the large distances that in order to relieve the strain on transportation and ease the food crisis, German divisions were ordered to live off the land as they marched east. This in turn led to the pillage and plunder of farms and cities in the occupied territories. Soldiers did not just take turnips and onions from the fields, they raided almost every allotment or kitchen garden that they passed. Chickens, ducks, and geese were the favourite spoils of war because they were so portable and easy to prepare for the pot. Clemens Podivils, a war correspondent attached to the 6th Army, described in his diary the arrival of a combat group from 16th Panzer Division in one village on the 30th of June following a sharp skirmish. Black figures jumped down from tanks and hearth tracks. Suddenly a great execution is carried out. The poultry, with bloody ruffs and beating their wings in a paroxysm, was carried back to the vehicles. The men jumped back on board, the tank tracks ground the soil, and the vehicles moved on again. Civilians who were deemed useful to the Germans were granted a food ration consisting of just 1,200 calories per day, and their dependents 850. That's not enough to survive on. Jews were given 420 calories. Basically nothing. Many more people in the towns and cities were simply starved. In Kiev in 1942, the Germans began confiscating all the food and prevented food coming into the city, leading to a decrease in the population by 315,000 by October 1943. 150,000 of Kharkov's 450,000 people would die of starvation by the end of 1942. Others were shipped to the slave labour camps of the Reich to work to death, again on starvation rations. This was why Hitler was heading east. Germany needed the oil of the Caucasus. If I do not get the oil of Mayakop and Grozny, then I must end the war. Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, had been launched with 3 army groups, North, Centre and South. This had failed to achieve victory and had cost the German army severely in manpower and material. For 1942, there was only enough oil, manpower and material to launch one army group forwards, and so Army Group South was reinforced. The plan, Fall Blau, ordered the securing of the northern flank along the Don and Volga rivers before driving south to seize the oil fields and farmlands of the Caucasus. And this was what Paulus's 6th Army was doing now, advancing east to secure the northern flank in preparation for the drive south. The city of Stalingrad wasn't important at this stage, not even to Hitler. Its capture was only to help secure the flank along the Volga, nothing more. However, on the 23rd of July 1942, the window for operational success was closing. Logistics were breaking down, stocks of fuel were running low, and as we have already seen, the troops were suffering from petrol shortages. If Germany didn't get oil soon, she would no longer be able to wage the war of movement she needed to wage in order to win the war, and she would lose the static attritional war which would follow. Blau had also seen the disintegration of the Red Army in the south, giving the impression that the Soviets were on their last legs and were incapable of stopping the mighty German Wehrmacht from achieving victory. Hitler and the Army High Command had believed that they had just witnessed the Red Army collapse. Now, in Hitler's mind, the only thing stopping the Germans from getting to Astrakhan was the terrain and the fuel gauge. He concludes that the Soviets will not be able to create a viable defensive position west of the Volga River. Because of this, Hitler decides that now was the time to roll the dice once more. Rather than strike east to Astrakhan first, form a northern blocking line, then strike south to the Caucasus oil fields, Hitler instructs Army Group B to strike towards Astrakhan, while Army Group A moves south into the Caucasus. This was his Führer Directive number 45, arguably the event that loses Hitler the entire 1942 campaign. Including the Voronezh area, this order basically splits two half-army groups over three strategic axes at the same time. This was a big gamble, but Hitler feels that there's no alternative. As part of this order, he sends 4 armies south in Army Group A, 1st and 4th Panzer Armies, 17th Army, and the Romanian 3rd Army. Army Group B would consist of the German 2nd, Hungarian 2nd, Italian 8th, and the German 6th Armies. 6th Army was also ordered, for the first time, to actually take the city of Stalingrad for an eventual thrust on Astrakhan. Hitler thinks the Soviets have been defeated and decides now is the right time to dilute his forces in the hope that they can get the oil he desperately needs. But he has misjudged the military situation. In reality, instead of defeated remnants, Paulus's 6th Army is now left alone to face the undefeated and quite powerful Red Army forces of Gordov's Stalingrad front. Another special thanks goes to Terry Young, the graphic designer who created the detailed maps used throughout this series. Check out her website, terryyoungdesigns.co.uk, link in the description. In the scorching heat of the 23rd of July, Paulus's mobile divisions advanced towards Kolpachi's embryonic lines. Schlomer's division, supported by parts of Zanner's and Kolomen's divisions, took Kletskaya at 0900 hours after a brief battle with the separated battalions of the Soviet 427th Rifle Regiment. They then headed south. 160th Panzer Battalion led the way for Camp Group 60, which pierced the enemy's lines at 1000 hours. But stubborn Soviet resistance slowed their attack down, so 103rd Panzer Battalion was ordered to veer west to help them out. This would hopefully catch the enemy ahead of Camp Group 60 in the flank. Skornyekov's 40th Tank Brigade responded by counterattacking 103rd Panzer Battalion, part of which, Henn's 1st Company, was caught in a gully and attacked on all sides. Then, when Skorniakov's brigade attempted to outflank 103rd Panzer Battalion, 160th Panzer Battalion from 60th Motorized Division appeared and hit them hard. In this meeting engagement, the Soviet tanks got pummeled. The Germans counted 21 Soviet T-34s and KV tanks destroyed in this action south of Platonov. It's not clear how many German tanks were knocked out, but there was only a handful of casualties in this action for both panzer battalions. Meanwhile, the forward unit of Yudvenka's 33rd Guards Rifle Division, 84th Guards Rifle Regiment, were hit by 16th Panzer Division and, despite stubborn resistance by their anti-tank gunners, were compelled to fall back. Huber's panzers reached the area 10 kilometers from Kolpachi's main defences along the Dobraya River. Volhin's 147th Rifle Division also reported its forward units were engaged against motorcycle infantry from Pfeffer's 297th Infantry Division. Clearly, Kolpachi's right wing was smashed, but he tried to make the most of it by not reporting, at first, that Zakharenka's 192nd Rifle Division was withdrawing. When he did report it later that evening, he made sure to mention that it was alright because his 40th Tank Brigade was striking back. Of course, this counterattack had already failed, but there was no need to admit that to the higher-ups at this time. In the air, 6 unescorted Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers were set upon by 5 Yak-7Bs, a new Soviet aircraft design. Where the German or Italian fighter escorts had got to is not clear, but the inexperienced and ill-trained crews of the Soviet aircraft had a difficult time of it as it was. The Soviet flight leader had to attack the same bomber 18 times in order to bring it down, and his own aircraft had so many holes in it that he had to make a forced landing himself. It was no wonder that the German pilots felt so superior to their Soviet counterparts. It was now that Hitler realised that the 6th Army required more armoured support if it was to take Stalingrad on the march. He therefore assigned Langermann's 24th Panzer Corps to Paulus's army. This consisted of just one division, but it was an important one: Hauenschildt's 24th Panzer Division. This had initially been the 1st Cavalry Division before it was converted to a Panzer Division. This was why it had the Leaping Horseman symbol as its logo. But don't be fooled by their previous role. This was an elite division with experienced men within it, and we'll be seeing this unit a lot during the series. And Halder, Chief of the General Staff for the Army High Command, is not happy with this move, calling it a diversion of resources to 6th Army. Führer Situation Conference. In consequence of the concentration of army ordered by the Führer on the 17th of July over my opposition, and the diversion of 24th Panzer Division to 6th Army directed by him on the 21st of July, it is becoming obvious even to the layman that the Rostov area is crammed with armour which has nothing to do, while the critical outer wing of Timlienskaya is starving for it. I warned empathically against both of these developments. Now that the result is so palpable, he explodes in a fit of insane rage and hurls the gravest reproaches against the General Staff. This chronic tendency to underrate enemy capabilities is gradually assuming grotesque proportions and develops into a positive danger. The situation is getting more and more intolerable. There is no room for any serious work. This so-called leadership is characterized by a pathological reacting to the impressions of the moment and a total lack of any understanding of the command machinery and its possibilities. Fall Blau wasn't going so well, but it would be a mistake to say that Paulus didn't need 24th Panzer Division right now. 6th Army was going to need all the help it could get, and even Halder didn't realise that at this stage. So, with this additional tank support, Paulus decided to revise his plan of attack. Weitersheim's 14th Panzer Corps and Heitz's 8th Army Corps would attack from the north towards the Don River at Kalach. At the same time, 24th Panzer Division with 51st Army Corps' 3 infantry divisions would strike through 64th Army's lines south of the Cher River and advance to Kalach as well. These two moves would encircle the Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies west of the Don and allow Paulus to crush them completely, at which point there would be nothing left to stop 6th Army from taking Stalingrad on the march. With an attack about to hit them, 64th Army was hastily digging into its new positions. However, apart from Sazin's 229th Rifle Division, which had relieved the 196th Rifle Division and now occupied their trenches, the rest of the units in 64th Army found nothing but open ground on which to prepare their defences. Essentially, they weren't ready at all for the incoming Axis attack. And worse, their new commander was in trouble. Chukov was flying over the battlefield this day in an unarmed reconnaissance biplane when a German Ju-88 appeared in the sky. Guns fired. Chukov's pilot tried to find some cover in a village or a wood, but the steppe was barren. After several more bursts, Chukov's biplane was hit. It fell from the sky, and when the machine impacted the ground, it tore in half and burst into flames. Luckily, Chukov and his pilot were thrown out of their aircraft on impact with the ground just as the fire started. Somehow, they both walked away with only minor bruising. The reason why they survived was probably because they were flying so close to the ground in a slow-moving aircraft that the impact wasn't so fast. But either way, it was certainly a close call for General Chukov. 24th of July 1942. Marching forwards, 297th and 71st Infantry Divisions of General de Artillerie Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach's 51st Army Corps, assisted later in the day by 24th Panzer Division when it got to the front, attacked eastwards along both banks of the Cher. There was no defence in depth in the 64th Army area, so shattered forward units roamed around, confused and disheartened, whilst the Luftwaffe circled overhead, happily dropping their bombs on them without mercy. These forward units scarpered back to 64th Army's main line, which the German divisions now closed up to. In response, Chukov ordered his newly arriving units, Sologub's 112th Rifle Division and the 66th Naval Rifle and 137th Tank Brigades, into the Nizhny-Cherskaya area to form some sort of defence in depth. The initiative lay in the hands of the enemy, who, it must be said, had prepared for this offensive thoroughly. The 64th Army had only just consolidated this line of defence, was without well-equipped positions, and without well-organised transport of military stores and rations. The army's rear stretched as far back as Tula. The bulk of 16th Panzer and 113th Infantry Divisions smashed through 62nd Army's centre, and pushed Kolpachi's forces back another 15 kilometres towards the Don. To the north, 3rd and 60th Motorised Divisions cut through the remaining defences of 192nd Rifle Division, whose headquarters had been overrun, and began to advance southeast. But fuel was short, so only the best vehicles in Camp Group 60 got some. And 3rd Motorised Division had practically run out of fuel by this point, only having enough for a small combat spearhead. Leaving elements behind to wait for fuel, these Kampfgruppen wheeled south at noon, with 3rd Motorised Division's spearhead taking the village of Buzinovka. Here, they repulsed enemy tanks which were trying to break through to the north. Despite the fuel issues and the resistance, Camp Group 60 reached the village of Ozinovsky that evening. Elements of Schlomer's spearhead went even further and arrived at Lipologovsky. They had gone 50 miles, and Schlomer's division was now less than 10 kilometers from Kalach. Effectively, these two divisions had thrust a long shadowed spear of armour and motorised infantry running from Kletskaya to the Don. By the evening, Weitersheim's 14th Panzer Corps, with 113th Infantry Division's help, had encircled a third of Kolpakchi's army on the high ground east of Perelazovsky. Colonel Konstantin Zhuravlev from 62nd Army's command was flown into the pocket to take overall charge of the units inside, which included almost all of Udvenka's 33rd Guards Rifle Division, all of Koida's 184th Rifle Division, Skornyakov's 40th Tank Brigade, and 644th Tank Battalion. Most of 192nd Rifle Division was inside the pocket as well, because their rifle regiments had withdrawn south rather than to the area east of Kletskaya, where their overrun headquarters had fled to. And the headquarters of the 184th Rifle Division had also been overrun, leaving the pocket without a central headquarters or chain of command to lead it. Zhuravlev would have his work cut out for him. However, the pocket wasn't fully closed, due to the fact that most of Weitersheim's units were so crippled by fuel shortages that they couldn't actually reach the required areas in order to solidify the ring. To the south, 181st and 147th Rifle Divisions managed to hold the centre of the front against the Austrian 44th Infantry Division's attacks. And Colonel Tanashinshin's 13th Tank Corps had also been thrown in to battle Huber's panzers. But these actions weren't enough to excuse the fact that the Axis had clearly smashed the Soviet defences. Kolpakchi was even compelled to admit to his superiors that he didn't know where most of his units were, since he had lost communications with them. Clearly, the situation was once again slipping beyond the control of the Red Army. Both Gordov and Vasilevsky could see that 62nd and 64th Armies needed support. Vasilevsky therefore proposed to Stalin that they mount a counterattack with two new armies, the 1st and 4th Tank Armies, which were moving to the area. At first, Stalin was reluctant to commit to this counterattack, but Vasilevsky managed to persuade him. And it seems that from that moment onwards, Stalin was determined to mount the attack. The appropriate orders were therefore issued to 1st and 4th Tank Armies, and the tables were about to be turned against the 6th Army. 25th of July 1942. In the north, the Kampfgruppen from 3rd and 60th Motorised Divisions had to siphon fuel from some panzers in order to keep the others going. But going they did, with both Kampfgruppen advancing south towards Kalach. 3rd Motorised Division's artillery fired on the wooden Kalach bridge. But despite some direct hits, it held. 88mm flak guns were set up in support of Pfau's 53rd Motorcycle Battalion, which also fired at Soviet reinforcements moving across the river. One of those reinforcing units was Lebedenko's 55th Tank Brigade. In fact, Lebedenko's own tank almost went into the water as a result of the German fire. But Lebedenko had successfully crossed the bridge, as had Lebedev's 56th Tank Brigade. Both of these units were from Rodin's 28th Tank Corps, itself the first unit to arrive from Major General Moskalenko's 1st Tank Army. Such was the desperation to reinforce 64th and 62nd Armies at the Don Bend that the third part of Rodin's corps hadn't yet arrived, and not all of the first two parts had arrived either. While these units crossed over the Don, Kampfgruppe 60 captured the hamlet of Lozki. And to the Soviets, it looked like it might reach Kalach. So, Kolpachi ordered that Rodin's 28th Tank Corps mount a counterattack to smash 14th Panzer Corps' spearhead. General Pushkin, deputy front commander, also ordered an attack towards the village of Lozki. When asked if the tanks would have artillery support, Pushkin replied, "Very little. In fact, there won't be any." However, Rodin of 28th Tank Corps decided that the overall situation was so critical that he had no choice but to commit his troops piecemeal against the 3rd and 60th Motorised Division's forward units. Thus, Lebedenko's and Lebedev's tank brigades attacked northwards, a wall of Soviet steel aiming to shatter the German spear. Would they succeed? Will the Germans have the strength to stop them? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.